Good evening, everyone. Uh, Thank you again for joining us at the Westdale. I hope I'm being heard and seen properly. Maybe after 7 or 8 of these, we'll get it all technically right. As you know, the Westdale Theater is closed, and we will continue to do this kind of online programming and have our film clubs and film talks, and we're also working on some new programming as well. Other types of talk series and maybe even a music series. Of course, we don't know when we'll be able to open again. We're starting to see if it's possible, and we're going to be talking to the various people at the city and medical officials, and we would love to be open, and hopefully that time is coming, though of course it'll be a very different experience than it is now. But meanwhile, this has been a fantastic experience for me, and I hope for you, because what we're trying to do is look at the great classic films of history and viewing them again, perhaps in a bit of a different light, because many of you probably have seen them before. But watching them now in this during this crisis and during this period of isolation, and of course, great movies will always feel different every time you watch them, and you'll have a different experience depending upon what your awareness is at the moment and what are the things you're thinking about and feeling. And this was certainly very true for me personally, watching Schindler's List again this week. This is a movie I remember very well when I first saw in the theaters in 1993 when it was released, and being, very affected by it. I was raised in a Jewish household, and although I did not have any relatives who were directly involved in the Holocaust, I certainly had many friends who did, and the stories and the history of what happened then was very much present in my Jewish education. And watching the film this week really was interesting in terms of sort of putting a little perspective on this, horrible experience and crisis we're having with the virus. I, like many of you, feel like I'm suffering and really have a lot of challenges in continuing to stay very positive and active and continue to grow and evolve. And then you watch a movie like this, and it reminds me how fortunate, I've been, most of us have been. I'm 65 years old, and I've never been through a crisis like this. I mean, there's never been, a historical event of this magnitude with this impact that's happened in my lifetime. And that's certainly not true for, an older generation who went through 2 world wars or through the Depression, and of course, other epidemics like the Spanish flu. And it kind of put things a little bit in perspective for me, at least, and recognizing that how fortunate I am, and still fortunate even in this crisis, to feel safe, to be able to find food, to have our freedom, and to enjoy, the loved ones we can't see. So that in itself turned out to be, I hadn't really thought about that when I originally picked the film, but it turned out to be quite a wonderful thing for me, at least. And of course, it just reminded me again of the power of cinema, and particularly with this film, that cinema can be much more than just entertainment. It's not that Vertigo wasn't a great movie or Lawrence of Arabia was a great movie, but this is a film that really had a profound impact. It was a historical phenomenon when this film came out. And it really did, I think, change how people think and feel, and their understanding, perhaps, of human nature. That this was a kind of film that, and of course, the film was used educationally in schools quite a bit after this, and it really seemed to make a big difference and provide something that just didn't exist before. And in fact, Spielberg himself said, I've never felt since Schindler's List the kind of pride and satisfaction and sense of real, meaningful accomplishment. This was certainly the most, the pinnacle of his career. I found it to be an extraordinary film to watch again. And certainly, I don't think he's ever done anything like this. It was, a very personal film for him. And of course, he's an incredibly successful director, but there really has never been a film of this magnitude for him before. And of course, it was recognized. There were 12 Academy Award nominations. It won 7 Academy Awards. And again, part of this was the timing, I think, when it was released. It was released in 93, and this was just a few months after the opening of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, which was quite a big deal. And it really seemed to address what one might say a bit of a gap in the historical representation of the Holocaust. That certainly there's a lot of footage that had survived, and stills that had survived, and individual stories, and obviously books, the Diary of Anne Frank, etc. But this film truly was a phenomenon. It was not just a critical success, but it was an incredibly popular film as well. It was made for a very small budget, around $22 million, and it grossed over $321 million worldwide. And that was very much Spielberg's intention. He wasn't trying to make this film for the people who already knew the story and who already had a lot of experience and an emotional understanding of what happened with the Holocaust. He was making this as popular entertainment. He was making this for people who really didn't have a clear relationship or understanding of what the Holocaust actually was and how it came about. And I think it was extraordinarily brave of him to go and try to do this, and obviously using all of his technical craft and his incredible talent as a filmmaker, he was managed to make a film that does represent, and of course, we'll talk about, because this film was very controversial as well when it came out, in terms of how it represented these historical moments in history. But he really did manage to find a way to bring this story to many, many people, and to bring an awareness and a reminder of this, horrible time in history. And it's kind of, again, this was made 22 years ago. And, actually, what am I saying? 28 years ago, and about events 75 years ago. But for me, watching it today still felt unbelievably relevant, and it was very powerful. You know, but again, what he managed to do here was kind of miraculous, because, Spielberg sort of has made, a feel-good movie about the ultimate feel-bad experience, and certainly, other Holocaust films didn't try to take that position, but you walk out of, the experience of watching this movie with this sense of, wow, there's good in the world, and that this was really, that good triumphed over evil, and that there was something that, was very, somehow uplifting about this film. And again, there were many people who thought this was a bit controversial, that, this is not an experience, this wasn't a period of history that one should remember, fondly, or think about as being something that, is appropriate for mass entertainment. But again, you have to weigh ultimately, what he managed to accomplish, both in terms of cinematic terms and cinematic history, but also in terms of, again, making this very dark period of history accessible to a large audience who probably would not have watched a Holocaust documentary or a dark, very, very depressing and disturbing movie, which this certainly was at times. And the theme of good versus evil is certainly one of the great themes of most films. But what was kind of so unusual about this, and again, this goes back to the book, and we're going to talk about the book, because Schindler's Ark by Thomas Keneally was certainly, and based on a true story, of course, because her Schindler was a real individual. but it was very clever in a way that using the main protagonist is sort of was a German and a Nazi. It's not a Holocaust survivor. He's not even Jewish, and he's the main character of a film about the Holocaust. Kind of an unusual approach to this story, but in a sense, that main protagonist, and of course Liam Neeson played him so beautifully, was a characterization in American cinema we had seen before, and it kind of felt comfortable to us. And again, I think it allowed the audience to really get involved in him and involved with his character in a very interesting way. And then, of course, what an incredible antagonist in Goethe, and and again characterized as, as we often think of these Nazis, completely dark, evil people, pathological, sadistic killers, and then watching Schindler ultimately, co-opt him and defeat him and be the rescuer, the hero. That sort of classic film storytelling doesn't really have a lot to do with the Holocaust in a way, but again, it made for a character, story that was accessible to a lot of audience. And then, of course, the second theme is redemption, which is, a big part of the Jewish story in general. But here it's being told through this character of Schindler, who's a very, disreputable schemer and very, the edge of respectability. And I mean, this, kind of conniving con artist. And he becomes the father figure responsible for saving the lives of more than 1,000 people. We always talk about, character transformation in film. I can't think of a more dramatic, transformation than that, and in a sense, these are sort of, again, parallel character studies between, a con man and a psychopath, and also, in a sense, pure good and pure evil. Because so many films today, we have these conflicted characters, and oh, maybe they're good, or maybe what they're doing is good, or is it good for them and their family? And then, the evil guy often has some, backstory and why he's evil. But none of that is at stake here. Here, the characters are, in a sense, pretty clear cut in terms of, what and who they are and how they act. And of course, there is ultimately a mystery about Schindler and why he transformed and how he transformed that we'll talk a little bit about. But what he was doing was good, and the list was good. And of course, there's a wonderful moment at the end when they give him the ring, the people he's saved, and it has that Talmudic saying, "Whoever saves one life saves the world entire," and that's good. There's no question about it, right? So again, there were many, important questions about genocide and historical memory and all that are sort of unresolved. And so it's a problematic movie in certain ways, and it certainly was not universally praised when it came out. But it was a way to take a subject so vast and so tragic, but have some kind of affirming, that resistance to evil is possible and can succeed, and that's an inspirational story for all of this. So what else would well, I'll just sort of jump into a little bit of some of the things of why I feel this movie was so successful. Again, this is a story that, from our perspective, thinking about today, the horrors and the atrocities that were committed, and it's almost hard to be we've almost become desensitized to it. Such disbelief that this could have ever even happened. That how can you help an audience grasp the full emotional reality of what the Holocaust was? And in a sense, I think one of the genius things that Spielberg was able to do was to sort of overcome that. And certainly we feel the fear and the uncertainty and what it was like in the ghetto, or riding, in his trains and at the camps. But and we feel active. We feel like, we're part of this story. Again, I think over 60% of the movie is shot handheld, and we're right there, and there are, characters on the screen, and we do get involved with them, and that kind of viewer to character connection is essential in all of Spielberg's movies and all movies, because by humanizing these characters, we are able to, experience these atrocities in, I don't want to say a safe way, but in a way that we feel like, this is all worthwhile and we're invested in this story. And Spielberg, he's a very brilliant guy. He was very conscious of this, and he really wanted to impact the audience, and he really desired to remind the world of, the horror of the war, and that, no one could really sit passively and watch this movie without being affected in some way, and potentially do something. So. He manages to do this, I think, but at the same time, there's still at a heart some of a mystery, because this is a case of a man doing, the opposite of what he seems to be doing, right? He seems to be this, con man, businessman, just trying to make money for himself, and then ultimately we find out, and the audience finds out that he's not. But the director, we sort of have to figure it out ourselves in a way. It's not, there's no great speech where Schindler suddenly, says, oh, now I'm gonna, this is really all I care about is saving the Jews. There's no moment like that in the film. We just have to watch his behavior and slowly recognize how and when it changes, and then be able to speculate what's going on inside his head, which I think is, it was actually very brilliant, because it really involves you in the movie in a much bigger way. And of course there's some similarity between, Schindler and Spielberg, because, these are both, larger than life figures. But what did they do? How did they succeed? Well, Schindler succeeded through manipulation. He was a, showman. He was telling this story. He was playing a character. He was, it was a very, constructed plan to do what he wanted to do. And when and in a sense, Spielberg and all entertainers or film directors, are playing to an audience. They're using a story and their tools and their actors to, to entertain and to, make, and get the audience to respond and be emotionally involved. But in this case, both of them are doing it in service of a very deep and very important cause. So, there are interesting parallels, I thought, this time in watching Schindler and thinking about Spielberg, and we'll talk a little bit about his life as well. So it really began with the Australian novelist, great novelist named Thomas Keneally. And Keneally, it was almost an accident, because he was in Europe and he wandered into a shop that was owned by a guy named Poldek Pfefferberg. And Pfefferberg is a character in this. And Pfefferberg was someone who had been researching Schindler. He was one of the men on the Schindler's List. He had extensive files on Schindler. He had a copy of the original list, and he had been making an effort for many years to bring this story to light in one form or another. And there had been other interest in this, including films and Hollywood, but nothing had really emerged. And in 1980, Keneally met him, almost by accident, and became so interested in this story that he decided to write a book, right? And again, what he found so interesting was this, this character, and there was no clear delineation of where the opportunism, ended and the altruism began. And the idea, this is a quote from him, and I like the subversive fact that the spirit breathes where it will. That is, that good will emerge from the most unlikely places. And that, so the book itself, which came out in 82, was very popular. It was very well received. It was called Schindler's Ark in most of the world. I think it was changed to Schindler's List here in America, though. And the person who first picked up it in Hollywood on it was the guy who was running Universal at the time, Sid Sheinberg, a Jewish guy. And he immediately saw the power of this book when it first came out, and he wound up picking up the movie rights, and then he, with Spielberg, they had made a number of movies together, but this was back in 1982, and it was not until 10 years later that this film, 11 years later, this film got made, and Spielberg, was very interested in the subject, but as he says himself, he wasn't really ready to make this film. He was developing his own consciousness about the Holocaust, right? And of course, this film did not reflect any of the Spielberg's themes, from most of his films, parent-child relationships, or E.T. or Close Encounters and experiences with, E.T.s and so you could imagine that this was something a little intimidating and something he wasn't sure about what he was going to do. Ultimately, of course, it is his most personal film, and all of the craft and everything that he achieved, in his other films, he brought to this movie. And so again, very, very different than the kinds of films. Now, as a child growing up, he did grow up in an Orthodox Jewish family, and his paternal grandparents were from Ukraine, not Poland, but Ukraine, from Russia. And he was originally born in New Jersey, but then wound up, growing up in Phoenix, Arizona. But he did attend Hebrew school for about 4 years when he was a kid. And he really struggled with being an Orthodox Jew, especially not living in an Orthodox Jewish community. And but he was quite embarrassed by the fact that his parents were Jewish. He didn't want to be different. He didn't want to be separate. He didn't, appreciate the practices, and it was a very difficult time. And he was subject to some anti-Semitic prejudice and bullying. But he certainly did hear the stories, from his grandparents about their life in religious persecution, and was certainly aware of the Holocaust. And I think his father lost between 15 and 20 relatives, and what's very interesting is that he sort of left Judaism. He didn't practice Judaism for a long time until he married Kate Capshaw, who was not Jewish. But Kate Capshaw made the decision to convert to Judaism, and before they were married. And it was only, in fact, after they were married and through Kate, his wife, that he really rediscovered his own Judaism, which is very interesting to me. And they, raised their children Jewish, but that's what brought him back to Judaism more than anything else. And I don't really know exactly what was going on with Kate Capshaw and why she did this, but it's just an interesting evolution of how people can lose touch with their Judaism. It comes back to them, back and forth. So meanwhile, let's see. So the development, as I mentioned, that the book, and of course he was drawn, because of the paradoxical nature of the character, and that became very interesting to him, even beyond just being the story of the Holocaust, right? And and it took 10 years again for it to come together. He was, at first, again, unsure if he was even the right person, maybe as a producer, but he actually went to other directors to do the movie. And of course, the first person he went to was Roman Polanski, who would have been an unbelievable choice to direct this movie. And Polanski, in fact, as a kid, was in the Krakow ghetto. He was actually there and managed to escape as a 6, 7-year-old. But he turned it down. And remember, there hadn't been a Holocaust movie like this, a successful dramatic film. I don't think it had ever been made. And eventually, of course, Polanski did make his own Holocaust drama, The Pianist, which also won an Academy Award, but that was about 10 years later. But he also offered the movie to Sidney Pollack and Martin Scorsese. Martin Scorsese was attached to direct Schindler's List in 1988. And then ultimately, Spielberg realized that this is just something he had to do. And he had to do it for his children and his family. And he managed to trade another film with Scorsese. He gave him the rights that Spielberg had to remake Cape Fear, and instead Spielberg and Scorsese did go on to make Cape Fear. Billy Wilder was interested in directing the film. Brian De Palma was talked to about it. But either way, ultimately Spielberg realized no one could do this film but him. And now, when he went to make a deal with Universal to finally make the film, Sid Sheinberg said, "Well, I'll greenlight the film, but only on one condition: you have to shoot Jurassic Park first, because that was another film he had in development." Because Sheinberg knew that if once Spielberg had done Schindler's List, he wouldn't be able to do Jurassic Park. So he went off and did Jurassic Park. And in fact, the whole time he was shooting Schindler's List, he was editing Jurassic Park at night. And in fact, both films came out that year. And Jurassic Park, of course, went on to become, I think at the time, the most successful film of all time. It was a huge blockbuster, Spielberg type, amusement park ride. And here is, Schindler's List coming out in, I think, November, December in the same exact year. It's kind of amazing. Spielberg agreed to take no salary. They did it for $22 million, incredibly low fee. The script was not an easy script. That development went on for years. Keneally tried to write a script himself, but he was very focused on Schindler and all his different relationships, really couldn't condense the book. Then another writer, Kurt Woodke, a wonderful screenwriter, he wrote Out of Africa and many other great movies. He tried to do a draft, and after 3 or 4 years, that didn't work either. Finally, actually through Scorsese, Spielberg met Steve Zalian, who had worked with Scorsese before. And Zalian wrote the script that actually did get made. In fact, Zalian's script was almost too short, and Spielberg wanted to put quite a bit back into it. Zalian's a fantastic writer. Besides winning Academy Award for Schindler's List, he's also been nominated for films like Gangs of New York and The Irishman, and he works quite a bit with Scorsese, Moneyball, and also Jewish, by the way, the screenwriter. But again, Spielberg wanted it's a 3-hour and 15-minute movie. That's not usual. I mean, that's not how films get made, in those days either. But for the price and the support of Sheinberg and Universal, he was allowed to do it, and he obviously added a lot of other things to the script that were interesting to him. For example, the Ghetto liquidation sequence is not a huge part of the original screenplay, and he felt so strongly about that sequence, and we'll talk about it a little, and that he just, there was no way he could telescope or shorthand some of the things that were going on. And, an interesting part of the script was also how to use language, because there's quite a bit of German and Polish language, spoken in the film, and that creates a sense of realism. And in fact, he considered for a while making the film entirely in those languages, but he was very concerned about audiences reading subtitles, and that it would have been an excuse for the audience to take their eyes off the screen and watch something else. And he really wanted this to be as immersive experience as possible, and by being in English, as accessible as possible. Casting is always extraordinary, the processes that go on. Liam Neeson did come in screen test. He was an early choice. He certainly had done some successful films, but was not considered a movie star. Believe it or not, people like Kevin Costner and Warren Beatty and even Mel Gibson were considered to play Schindler, which I find amusing. But again, I think Liam Neeson ultimately was almost perfectly cast in the role, and he really was able to capture all the charisma and all the charm, but at the same time, you felt like you were watching this very thinking and complex man who did have feelings and did have plans, and just did an incredible job. He was nominated for an Academy Award for his role. He ultimately did not win. That was the year that Tom Hanks won for Philadelphia, an incredible performance. But he is possibly the best role that certainly Liam Neeson ever performed. And of course, he was playing a character that was so extraordinary. And he was just found himself in this unique position, and he rose to the occasion and did something extraordinary. And if you watch the film, again, this is where the power of the image and the cinematography, because, he's lit like a movie star. He dresses like a movie star. There's this mystery to his character. It's really a kind of almost a classic film star role to be playing in the midst of this very, very dark, dark story. And I think the contrast there and how the story of the film, makes this all work is really kind of extraordinary. Then, of course, Ray Fiennes, who was cast as Amon Gotha, was not well known at all. He had done a few things in England, but Fiennes, Ray Fiennes was a very well trained actor, and according to Spielberg, his audition was just incredible. That he was able to just bring that kind of sexual evil and an incredible amount of subtlety, where there were moments of kindness in his eyes, and then they could instantly run cold. And I mean, again, shocking that he did not win the Academy Award that year, but one of his great performances, he put on about 28 pounds to play the role, because Fiennes is kind of a skinny guy, and did a ton of research and really getting into this character. And Fiennes says, I got close to his pain. Inside him is a fractured, miserable human being. I feel split about him, sorry for him. He's some dirty, battered doll I was given that I came to feel peculiarly attached to, and of course this, psychopath, sadist, and Fiennes, they say, looked remarkably like Goethe in costume. But his performance to me was amazing, because somehow he was able to make, I wouldn't say us sympathetic to this character, but he somehow was able to give some kind of human dimension to the character. So at least it felt like a worthy participant in this story. One of the criticisms, though, of Schindler's List was that possibly it was a weakness in the script to make Goethe, insane and crazy, and would have been dramatic and even more interesting if that character was more of a normal sort of Nazi functionary, that he was sort of an ordinary man who was following orders, and a kind of role and a storyline we've seen before with Nazi characters. And and that the terror of the Holocaust was not because of psychopathic monsters like Goethe, though there certainly were people like that, but because of these thousands of people who were, killed and snatched from their lives by ordinary people who were following orders. And, but I think the choice not to do that was also very, was interesting, because it could have distracted from, our primary story. And I guess ultimately that's not what Spielberg and in the book as well was interested in exploring. And so for the purposes of this story, I think the presentation of Goethe and of course Fiennes' performance is amazing. And of course, Itzhak Stern, Itzhak Stern didn't actually exist, Ben Kingsley's character. He was sort of a composite of 2 or 3 different characters, but the purpose he serves as, is Schindler's alter ego and conscience. Conscience is very powerful and very helpful, and I think between those 3 characters we have a really interesting dynamic, and in support of a film that it doesn't really explain evil, but it really just insists that men can be good in the face of it, and that good can prevail. The production was, as you can imagine, very complicated. They shot it in Krakow, where it took place, over 72 days. They shot in black and white. And of course, that was a very, conscious decision. They wanted to create a sense of timelessness. They wanted the film to sort of have a documentary-like quality. As I mentioned, a lot of it was handheld. The cinematographer, Janusz Kaminski, is Polish. He's gone on to do, many, many great films. Worked with Spielberg on a lot of films, and, Academy Awards, etc. but this was one of his very first films. He won Best Cinematography. The film he also won for Saving Private Ryan, and of course they also embraced, which I think was very effective, the sort of German expressionist, film noirish kind of look from the 1930s, right? And if you look at films from that period, they all had that very strong key lighting and contrast and lots of low angle shots. There are some amazing shots, where Schindler's at the top of stairs in shadow and people in front, and some of the great big wide vista mise en scène shots, from the crow's nest at the chateau, and when Schindler's up on the top of the hill watching Krakow be emptied. It's interesting because again it sort of gave almost a polishing sheen, Hollywood sheen to some of these scenes, and especially Liam Neeson. He was lit like Humphrey Bogart. He was being lit like he was the movie star in the movie, but it really supported the characters and the situation. And then we would go from that to these very handheld shots. You're in the crowd, you're in the train car, and then the faces, because again, the people, the whole, most of the Jews were not known actors. These were all people cast in Poland or in Eastern Europe. Extraordinary faces, very, very real, very, very visceral, and we have that going on in sort of in a juxtaposition of some of the more beautiful and more polished look of the film. The music became a huge part of this, obviously, and we'll talk about that somewhat later with Zach Perlman doing those unbelievable violin solos. The movie was actually shot very close to the actual locations. The camp was reconstructed completely on an abandoned quarry. They couldn't use the original site. The original site, interestingly enough, was built on Jewish cemeteries. That's what the Nazis chose where they built the original site. And, and it was, you can imagine for the people involved in this film, it was kind of extraordinary. I mean, there were some Israeli actors as well who were part of this. And this whole experience, they really, like you can imagine, really became, a family and one race and one culture. And I'm sure it was an extraordinary experience being on this set. And in fact, there were scenes that would have been difficult to even watch, I'm sure, as they were unfolding in front of you. I know, so many of the crew members, even Spielberg himself, trying to watch the scene where the aging Jews are forced to run naked while being selected by Nazi doctors. It's kind of amazing, right? It's almost like at times we feel we're reporting, the scene, as I said, in more of a documentary style, and because it's just so hard, to watch this, they were done with great realism, right? So unlike all his films, Spielberg was like Hitchcock. He would always storyboard his films and plan it very, very carefully. This he did not do that way. He very much wanted to, be in the moment of the action and the experience and shoot like a documentary. They had to shoot very quickly. 72 days is actually very quickly for a film of this scale, and sort of that spontaneity and an edge seemed very appropriate for the film and very different than the style of most of Spielberg's movies that are very well thought and planned and specific shots. And here, there was no steady cams. You would notice there are very few elevated or crane shots or zoom lenses or all the tools that Spielberg always used. He kind of left behind because he really wanted to, again, try to stay true to the action that was happening in the film. And of course, being in black and white was extremely unusual at the time, but it also made the film timeless, right? Because now we watch the film and, 1993, it could have been made in the 50s, it could have been made, 5 years ago. The black and white does give it sort of a timeless quality. the head of the head of Universal begged him to shoot, in a color negative, even if the film was going to be printed in black and white for distribution now. So that one day, and yes, I'm going to get to the girl in the red coat pretty soon. So these, all of this kind of, and again, so it's, black and white. You can sort of have show some of the violence and the struggle of the film in a way that maybe the audience, it was more acceptable. If these scenes were all shot in color, I just can't even imagine. Watching them would have been very, very difficult. So, and of course there are, three moments of color, and the opening of the film, it just shows how powerful the image can be, because here we have all this complex story we're going to see, and of course it starts in color with the Jewish prayer candles burning down to leave only wisps of smoke, and really, how can there be more pure, symbol of the Holocaust than that? These beautiful candles turning to nothing. The opening scene, one of the very early scenes, fantastic scene, of course, is in the nightclub where it's frequented by the Nazis' officers, and he comes in with his, money in his pocket and clothes, and by the end of the scene, it's like, who's this man? All the girls are now sitting at his table. He's become the party. And who is Oscar Schindler? And he created this myth of who he was, because the real Oscar Schindler, of course, was not a successful businessman, and he was a Nazi, though. He actually was involved in the Nazi Party for several years. In fact, did some intelligence work for them in Czechoslovakia back in the mid-30s when. But that's a whole other story. But the Third Reich, the Germans never really figure out what this guy's up to. They just willing to take his money. But again, very interesting character. What incredible scene where Stern is arrested for not carrying his papers, and he's on the death train and about to be gone, and Oscar comes storming up and cons the guys into letting him go, and he's so upset, and he says to him, what if I'd been 5 minutes later, thinking he's so worried about, but then where would I be? I would have lost my accountant, So at this point, his self-interest is startling, but, perhaps very true to the character, right? And in fact, in general, the violence is kind of, in an odd way, not as violent as the movie might have been, and even Goethe with playing sniper, casually picking off the prisoners with his high-powered rifle. It's done in a very matter-of-fact way, and if that's something we could have been lingered on and expressed in and made a big deal, but it's just sort of a detail and a texture. So the disbursement of the ghetto scene. Now this is the most important scene in a sense in the film, because remember Schindler's up on the hill with his girlfriend, and they're looking down on the town while this is taking place. And of course, there's the girl in the red coat. So this is the second time color is used in the film, and people talk about this a lot, because what does the girl in the red coat really represent? So I think one of the things you might suggest, or people have suggested, is that in a sense she symbolizes how there were many people, in the very highest level of government in the U.S. and around the world, who knew the Holocaust was happening. This was not, you can't keep a secret about something like that. But nothing was done to stop this, right? This was something that was occurring. Again, the U.S. was not part of the war yet, or they might have just been joining the war. But everyone seemed to be fine and complicit with this idea of not seeing this girl. So here she was, wearing a red coat, walking down the street, but but nothing's happening to her, right? She doesn't get hit by a bomb. She's just sort of merrily going along, right? And again, that's the interpretation some people have. And And of course, this was the moment for Schindler that as he watches this, I think the audience starts to sense that he's starting to transform, and that this is when he may be starting to have his first realization of what's really happening and going to be happening to the Jewish people, and how can he just, stand there and watch it happen? And is there a chance for him to do something? Is there something that he could do? Um, and and again, this was then later. Of course, we see the girl's dead body, right? And that's not so long after. But he can no longer see this as something just as a convenience for him to run his factories, but it's really something that he decides ultimately that this was going to be his life work, and it was something he was going to do. And people talk about the red coat as, as a symbol of innocence or hope, or the red blood of the Jewish people being sacrificed in the horror of the Holocaust. I'm not really sure how that choice was made. I think the red coat stood out, from the black and white footage. But the other hand, maybe Spielberg did have a whole other, sense of representation of, certainly it's a warm color, and does make you feel like that, that there's something really unique and hopeful about this character. And then, of course, at the end, we see color again when we see the first images of the candles, when Schindler allows the workers to have a Shabbat service. And there's just a glint of color there with the flames, but it is a glimmer of hope, and it's at a point in the film where it could be, where it was very helpful. Again, there's no big speech. Schindler doesn't talk about how he changes his point of view, but things start to change. The incredible scene, of course, with Goethe, where they talk about power and what is real power. And Goethe believes, it's the power of life and death, that he can kill people whenever he feels like it. And Schindler very cleverly tells him this story about the great emperors, who also thought they had so much power, but they always recognized that their real power was not to kill, but their power was to pardon, and that being able to, give a life took more power in a way than taking a life. And of course, we see Goethe enjoying that idea and actually going around the camp trying. It's almost humorous, for a moment or two, where he does go around trying to pardon people and feel the power of that. But it's a sequence that does give us some insight into Schindler, because Schindler, of course, at this point is very clearly manipulating Goethe and trying to, and we start to gain insight as to what he's really thinking about, and etc. What other some of the impressive scenes? Of course, there's that whole sequence where he kisses the Jewish woman at his birthday party and has to go to jail and be rescued. And there's just so many wonderful scenes. A lot of it, of course, is done through the power of cinema, and this is what Spielberg really understands. And a great example is sort of when he's given the ring, by the people, and if you look at the tracking shots that really emphasize his movement, he starts up on a balcony or whatever, and comes down to be with the people when he gets it, and we show the reverse shot of Oscar and Stern and their emotions and their facial expressions, and then the incredible moment, of course, which Schindler talks about, he didn't do enough, and very, very emotional scene. His performance is great. And of course, it's interesting because we don't see that in a close-up. We see that more in a medium shot, because we want to see the massive amount of people behind Stern that Schindler has saved and are part of the sequence. It's not just two people. And then, of course, leaving in the car, there's this, it's incredible. There's a term in cinematography, focalization, where, you focus on a certain object in the scene. In this case, Schindler and his facial expression, and everything else sort of blurs away in the background, which helps, the audience really feel the impact of his sadness. and drama in the scene. And it felt, watching it this time, a little bit of a false note of cinema drama, or entertainment drama. But who's to say? I mean, this was a very complex man, and it's not. It wouldn't surprise me if ultimately he did live with a lot of guilt and a lot of sense of tragedy, of the tragedy around him. And as much as he did, there would always be this question about, could he do more or could he not do more? Um, of course, the scene when the women are transported to Auschwitz by accident, and we think they're all heading into the gas chamber. And then, of course, instead it is, a shower instead of being gassed. And there's really no explanation of what happened and why. But what an incredible dramatic moment for all of us to be with these naked women in this and their faces. I mean, some of the performances of these extras is just absolutely extraordinary. And then, of course, how does he rescue them is just total boldness, right? He just, it was never, he just was able to bring his charisma and charm and bribery and do things that no one else could have ever done. And then, of course, there's always that contrast of beauty, because some of the scenes are incredibly beautiful. And in fact, the scene of the arrival at night of the train to Auschwitz, and we see these beautiful sequences and light. And of course, it's snowing, and it's beautifully lit and dramatic. And then you sort of stop for a moment. And you go, well, wait a second, it's not snowing. Those are ashes of human beings that are falling on top of these people. Kind of amazing, right? So of course the ending is kind of I remember so clearly the first time I saw this movie, and the ending of the movie, and the wonderful irony of this Russian guy showing up and saying, well, there's a town over there. We see them all start walking to the town, and then of course we dissolve to the real survivors coming up over the hill in modern day, and of course, at first you're not quite clear, but then you soon recognize that a survivor is being accompanied by the actor who played them in the movie, and very, very incredible. And and this, and then of course the last shot with Liam Neeson, putting the rock, and that's a Jewish tradition, of course, of putting rocks on the gravestones. I don't know the history of that, but of course that's been something that it's been Jewish tradition forever. So kind of amazing, right? That that this whole story and how it was done and when it was done. Believe me, that was 25 years ago. A lot of those survivors don't exist today, and now they are part of this film forever, and all their descendants. What was the number? Like 6,000 people. So a couple more things. Post-production, of course, he has a brilliant editor, Michael Kahn, who's received 8 Academy Award nominations. I think he's the most nominated editor of all time. He's won 3 times. Schindler's List, Saving Private Ryan, Raiders of the Lost Ark. Of course, that's something that Spielberg knows. That's a great point, Dave. It was just that the rock is part of the Jewish tradition, because even poor people can leave something when they go visit a gravesite. I think I did know that and forgot it, but that is where that tradition comes from. So brilliantly edited, so much juxtaposition of cross-cutting. What was that? There's a wonderful scene where there's a marriage going on and a kiss, and meanwhile, I think Goethe is having this sadistic slap with his maid. Personally, I didn't enjoy watching those scenes. I guess there was a relevance and importance in revealing Goethe's character as a sadist, but I found those scenes, I don't know, maybe we become too sensitized to the abuse of women like that, but I found that very, very difficult to watch. But brilliantly edited. And then, of course, the score. John Williams did the score, who had collaborated with Spielberg many times. For John Williams actually turned him down at first. He says, "You need a better composer than I am for this film." And Spielberg's response was, "I know, but they're all dead." So he did what he could, and then of course bringing in Itzhak Perlman to play these incredibly piercing, beautiful violin solos that really emphasized some of the most dramatic movie. The music was sort of unusual, that there were times when there was no music at all, and then there'd be a sequence. Remember when the prisoners, for example, had to dig up the dead bodies because all the bodies were going to be exhumed. Where there's this big lush musical score going on, and I think it was effective and kind of gave us significance and the moment. But again, then there were other times when there were no music, but really powerful moment, of course, when Schindler's listening to Billie Holiday sing "God Bless the Child." I mean, perhaps it was a little on the nose, but that was right when Schindler was kind of making his decision about what he was going to do. So the reception, as I mentioned, was extraordinary, so bizarre that Jurassic Park came out that summer and was $1 billion movie or the best movie, and then here comes Schindler List, same director, same year. I can't imagine how busy shooting that movie all day he managed to edit Jurassic Park at night, but he did. Hugely successful, especially in Germany, believe it or not. It was shown in 500 theaters. Over 100,000 people went to see it in the first week alone. Something like 6 million people, have seen this. It was always been popular there. Worldwide success. Some incredible quotes. Jeffrey Katzenberg, who was the head of Disney, said, "I think Schindler's List will wind up being so much more important than a movie. I don't want to burden the film with too much, but I think it will bring peace on earth, goodwill to men. Enough of the right people will see it that will actually set the course of human affairs." You don't hear that spoken about even the most artistic films being made in Hollywood. So, it's an interesting film. It remains a bit of a litmus test in Hollywood movie making. And again, there's a lot of controversy about, is it morally defensible to dramatize unspeakable horror and traumatic real moments in history as mass entertainment, because that's what he was doing. He consciously wanted to make a movie that would be, seen by millions, and he used the tricks of mass entertainment to try to tell this story. What else can I tell you about it? It was praised for the narrative boldness, the visual audacity, emotional directness, but then others commented, this is really a film about styles of manhood, and how one deals with one's lessers, and the Jews function simply as a background and pawns of this dramatic contest. So, again, there was a lot of controversy about it, and there still is, to be honest with you. And they thought it was overly sentimentalized at times, but overall, the general idea was that it was an outstanding achievement. Billy Wilder praised it wildly. This couldn't have been done by a better man. The movie is absolute perfection. Even Polanski, said, "I certainly wouldn't have done as good a job as Spielberg because could not have been as objective as he was," which is sort of, Kubrick was funny because, of course, he had his own Holocaust movie that he wanted to make, and he never did make the film after this. But his comment, of course, was, "Think that's about the Holocaust? That was about success, wasn't it? The Holocaust is about 6 million people who were killed. Schindler's List is about the 800 people who weren't. So I don't know. Everybody has to have their own emotions and their own feelings about this, and again, depending about your own understanding of the Holocaust and the Jewish people and their journey through history. But there was one other thing he did that was quite extraordinary, though, that perhaps could even be more important and more meaningful ultimately than even this film, was that there's an amazing documentary that was made called Shoah, and it was made by Claude Lanzmann. It's a 10-hour documentary, and it's a very cinematic and rigorous film about the Holocaust, and it's direct interviews with witnesses, and that's the perpetrators, their survivors, all across the gamut, all of the people who were involved in the death camps. And it's shot in color. And it's not meant to recreate the past, and you don't actually see anything. It's just direct interviews with individuals telling their stories. But it has a powerful impact on you as a viewer, because you have to imagine then, the horrors that they're talking about. But it was done. I forget what year it was done, but it was extraordinary. But what happened was that Spielberg then started the Shoah Foundation, and that's a nonprofit organization that, I don't know if he started it, but he funds it, and it's created a massive archive where they continued even after this documentary to film interviews with survivors, and because many of them were quite old and dying. And this is all housed at USC in the archives there. And I'm not that familiar with it, but you can imagine as an incredible database and an opportunity to capture and to preserve for all time the truest version of the story as told by the witnesses themselves. This is certainly something that was very important to be done, and he did it, and it was done, and again, perhaps inspired and certainly impacted by his involvement in this film. So really amazing. So I appreciate everyone who was able to stick with this film. Who again, not the it's a challenging film, difficult film, and depressing film, but at least for me, I found it very valuable to watch at this time of the year, and I'm glad we had a chance to look at it. So, been thinking a little bit about next film. As you know, I've been choosing a lot of kind of well-known films, and not necessarily and films that you may have seen before. But I really, there are directors who I admire so much, David Lean, of course, and Coppola, and some of the other people we've talked about. But we have not had the chance to do a film about perhaps my favorite director, certainly from the classic time of Hollywood. And this is a director who went back to the silent era of Hollywood, and who is really considered the master, and certainly Spielberg and and Lucas, and they all talk about him. In fact, David Lean used to watch his movies all the time before he went and shot. And I'm talking, of course, about John Ford, who is best known for his westerns, but he made some amazing movies. How Green Was My Valley and Grapes of Wrath. Those movies actually won Best Picture back to back, and they weren't westerns. These were just incredibly great films. But the one I'm interested in talking about is what I think is his greatest movie that he made near the end of his life, and it was called The Searchers. And it stars John Wayne, but in a very different role than we had seen him before, and a young Natalie Wood, and is, I think, of course, one of the great classic films, and not just me, but all the film critics of all time, and explore some very interesting themes about about human condition, about history, particularly around the story of the West and what happened in America, but also that being a microcosm of many instances of the kind. Again, it was really, if you think about what happened with the Indians, that was a genocide, as well. That the Americans, it's a great film. And if you haven't seen it, I'm sure you'll enjoy it. If you have seen it, I haven't watched it in probably 20 years, so I know I'm going to enjoy watching it again. And I will be back here again on Monday night to talk about it. So thank you all for your time. Much appreciated. Take care. Have a good week.